I'm a CCTV supervisor at a government facility in Iowa. On my first night, they handed me a sheet of rules, strange ones. Never look directly at camera 7. If the man in the black hat appears, do not acknowledge him. If camera 19's hallway goes dark, keep your eyes on the monitors at all costs. By the sixth night, the rules had changed. They always change. And if you ever find yourself in my chair, make sure you know which version you're following. Welcome to the dark corner of YouTube you've just stumbled into. If you're new here, don't be afraid. Unless, of course, you should be. Go ahead and subscribe. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss the next story waiting for you in the shadows. And to my returning subscribers, you already know how deep this rabbit hole goes. Your support keeps the darkness alive. And for that, I'm grateful. Now, let's begin. When I first applied for the position of CCTV Supervisor at the government facility just outside Boone, Iowa, I didn't expect to hear back. Jobs like this usually went to people with connections, veterans, retired cops, or anyone who already had a clearance level higher than average. But 2 weeks after I sent my application, I got the call. The voice on the other end was flat, efficient, and without introduction. They told me I had been selected for an interview. The next day, a black SUV arrived outside my apartment at 6 in the morning, no license plates. The driver didn't speak to me the entire ride. The facility sat in the middle of cornfields, its perimeter surrounded by 2 layers of high fencing topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers who didn't look like the National Guard. The building itself was low and wide, constructed of concrete with no visible windows. The air smelled faintly of ozone, as if a thunderstorm had passed through minutes before. Inside, I was taken down a long corridor lined with white panels. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the kind of light that made it impossible to tell the time of day. The man who interviewed me introduced himself only as Mr. Grant. He had thin gray hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to look past me. He asked about my previous work. I told him I'd done security monitoring for a distribution center in Des Moines. He nodded slowly but didn't write anything down. Then he slid a stack of papers toward me. "These are your clearance agreements," he said. "Sign each page. Do not ask about the contents. Asking about the contents is grounds for termination." I hesitated for a moment, but the way he stared at me told me there was no real choice. I signed. Afterward, Mr. Grant led me into a large, dimly lit room. This would be my domain, the CCTV monitoring hub. Dozens of screens covered the walls, each showing different parts of the facility, both inside and outside. Most cameras displayed mundane images, empty hallways, locked doors, storage rooms, but a few showed places that didn't make sense. One camera displayed what looked like a dense forest. Another showed an old brick tunnel dripping with water. A third displayed what appeared to be a room full of antique furniture, though I had been told the building had no such rooms. Before I could ask about them, Mr. Grant handed me a laminated sheet of paper. The heading simply read, "Rules." They were as follows. 1. You must never, under any circumstances, turn off or look away from camera 19 between 2:13 a.m. and 2:16 a.m. 2. If you see the man in the black hat on camera 4, do not acknowledge him. Switch to another camera until he leaves. 3. If you notice static on camera 12, begin playing the provided audio file through the intercom system immediately. 4. Between 3 a.m. and 3:09 a.m., do not view camera 7. If the feed switches to it on its own, look away until the time passes. 5. Never speak to the cleaning staff after midnight. They are not employees. 6. If a camera feed goes black and does not return within 30 seconds, report it directly to Mr. Grant. Do not attempt to fix it yourself. 7. Do not leave the monitoring room until your shift ends, even if someone knocks on the door claiming to need help. The rules didn't sound like workplace guidelines. They sounded like warnings. My first instinct was to laugh, thinking it might be an elaborate hazing ritual. But Mr. Grant didn't smile. He simply pointed to the chair in front of the main console. "You start tonight," he said, and walked out without another word. That night, I returned for my shift at 11. The building was quiet, almost eerily so. I sat in the monitoring room, sipping coffee and scanning the feeds. The first 2 hours were uneventful. I watched a pair of guards do their rounds, saw a fox slip through the fence near the northwest corner, and caught a glimpse of the cleaning crew moving down the west corridor. It was exactly midnight when one of them passed the camera closest to my room. I considered waving just out of habit, but then I remembered Rule 5. Something about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, made me uneasy. Their heads didn't turn. Their faces weren't visible under the brims of their caps. At 2:12 a.m., my eyes kept darting to camera 19, which showed a plain hallway leading to a locked steel door. As the clock ticked over to 2:13, something began to happen. The lights in the hallway on the feed dimmed. The picture wavered slightly, like heat rising from asphalt. Then, from the far end, a figure began to walk toward the camera. It was tall, thin, and seemed to move with an unnatural smoothness. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt certain that if I looked away, it would get closer. My heart pounded. The figure stopped halfway down the hall and tilted its head, as if listening. For the next 2 minutes, it stood completely still, its shape flickering slightly on the monitor. At exactly 2:16, it turned and walked back the way it came, disappearing into the darkness. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. At 2:47 a.m., static began crawling across camera 12. Remembering Rule 3, I quickly opened the audio file. It was a low humming sound, deep and resonant, almost like the noise you hear when pressing your ear against a seashell. I let it play through the intercom. Slowly, the static cleared. Then came 3:05 a.m. The feed on camera 7 switched on its own, despite the fact that I hadn't touched it. The picture was dark at first, then adjusted to reveal a small, windowless room I'd never seen before. A chair sat in the center, and on it, someone was sitting. They had their back to the camera. Their head was shaved, and they were wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Their shoulders rose and fell with slow, deliberate breathing. I forced myself to look away, staring at the clock until 3:09 finally passed. When I glanced back, camera 7 had switched to another view on its own. At 3:30, someone knocked on the door to the monitoring room. The sound was soft, almost polite. I froze. The rules echoed in my head. Do not leave the monitoring room, even if someone knocks. Help me, a voice called. It sounded like a young woman, panicked and breathless. I gripped the edge of the desk, fighting the urge to open the door. The knocking grew louder. Then it stopped, and for a moment, I thought they'd gone. That's when I saw her on camera 4. A woman stood in the middle of the hallway, staring directly at the lens. She was pale, her eyes wide, and her hair hung wet over her face. Behind her, at the far end of the hallway, a man in a black hat stood motionless, watching. I quickly switched to another camera. The rest of the shift passed in silence, but my hands didn't stop shaking. When Mr. Grant arrived at 6 in the morning, I expected him to ask questions, to explain something, anything. Instead, he just said, "Good. You followed the rules? See you tonight." And then he walked out. By the time I left the facility, the sun was up and the cornfields swayed gently in the breeze. It almost felt normal again. But I couldn't stop thinking about the woman's face and the way she seemed to know I was watching. I had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. The second night felt different before it even began. I'd barely slept during the day, my dreams haunted by flickers of static, shadowed hallways, and the woman's pale face pressed close to the camera lens. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her again. Her mouth opening like she was about to say something, though no sound came. By the time the black SUV arrived to take me to the facility, my nerves were already frayed. The driver didn't greet me, just kept his eyes locked on the road, hands fixed at 10 and 2. The trip felt longer than the night before, as if the fields had stretched further out, pulling the facility deeper into isolation. When I entered the monitoring room, Mr. Grant was already there. He stood with his back to me, watching one of the screens. It was camera 12, the same one that had gone to static last night. The feed was clear now, an empty storage corridor lined with metal shelving. Without looking at me, he said, "You followed the rules. Keep doing that." Then he turned and left. No small talk, no questions. The clock read 11 p.m. exactly. My shift had begun. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. I cycled through the feeds, checking for anything out of place. The facility seemed still, almost frozen in its routines. But then, just after midnight, camera 4 caught my eye. The hallway was empty, at least at first glance. But as I watched, A shadow seemed to lengthen along the far wall. It stretched and shifted, though there was nothing to cast it. Then he appeared, the man in the black hat. His arrival wasn't like someone walking into frame. It was as if he was simply there one moment, not there the next. He stood completely still, facing the camera. The brim of his hat hid most of his face, but I could see the faint curve of a grin. I remembered the rule. Do not acknowledge him. Switch to another camera until he leaves, but my hand hovered over the controls, reluctant to move. Something about him held me in place. His stillness was wrong, almost too perfect, like the frame around him was frozen while the rest of the footage continued. Then he tilted his head. Not much, just a fraction. But I felt it like a sharp needle behind my eyes. My chest tightened and my hands began to sweat. I forced myself to switch to camera 2. Empty hallway. I flicked through several more feeds before returning to camera 4. He was gone. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was just catching up to the strangeness of the place, but the air in the monitoring room felt heavier after that, like something had been left behind. At 2:13 a.m., camera 19's hallway dimmed again. The same figure from the night before emerged from the shadows. I kept my eyes locked on it, following the rule exactly. The figure moved halfway down the hallway, head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening. This time, it stayed longer, until 2:17. My stomach dropped when I realized the rule had said until 2:16. But what was I supposed to do? Look away? The thought of breaking eye contact made my skin crawl. Eventually, it turned and vanished into the darkness. At 2:47 a.m., static hit camera 12 again. I played the humming audio file through the intercom, and slowly the image cleared. But just before the static disappeared completely, a shape flickered across the screen. A shape crouched low, too thin, moving on all fours. It was gone before I could be sure I'd seen it. Then came 3 a.m. This time, I didn't wait for the feed to change. I set my gaze firmly on camera 5, showing the outer perimeter near the southwest fence. But my peripheral vision caught it, the flicker of the system forcing camera 7 into view. Even without looking directly at it, I could feel the wrongness of that room. Something about the air in the monitoring room grew colder, heavier, as if whatever was inside that space knew I was near. I waited until 3:09 ticked past before daring to look back at the controls. When I did, my stomach tightened. Camera 7's feed was gone entirely. In its place was a black screen with a single word in white block letters, open. I didn't touch it. At 3:31, the knocking began again. 3 sharp raps, then silence. This time I didn't hear a woman's voice. Instead, it was a man. Calm, almost friendly. Hey, he said, as if greeting an old friend. I just need to check the wiring in there. My throat felt dry. You can open the door, he continued. You've been doing a good job. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap. I kept my eyes on the monitors. Then, without warning, camera 4 came to life. The man in the black hat stood just outside my room, his body angled toward the door. I could see the faint outline of his smile again. The voice at the door didn't match him. The lips under that shadowed brim weren't moving. The knocking started again, louder this time. The black hat man didn't move an inch. After a minute, the voice faded. The man on the monitor turned and walked away, though his steps didn't match the movement of his legs, as if the video was skipping frames. By the time the clock hit 4, my body felt stiff from tension. I didn't relax, not even when the last hours passed quietly. When Mr. Grant returned at 6, I expected him to acknowledge what had happened, but he didn't. He stepped into the room, glanced at the screens, and simply said, "You're adapting." He left without another word. I stayed seated for several minutes after he was gone, letting my heartbeat slow. The urge to quit was strong. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just surveillance work. It was something deeper, something that required rules because normal procedures weren't enough. But I didn't quit. And that night, as I lay in bed, I realized the real reason. I wanted to know what the rules were protecting us from. On my 3rd night, I came in more determined than afraid. Whatever this place was hiding, it was clear the rules weren't just guidelines, they were survival instructions. But part of me, a stubborn and dangerous part, wanted to test them. I needed to understand why they existed. When I entered the monitoring room, the air felt colder than usual. The hum of the equipment seemed quieter, like the whole place was holding its breath. Mr. Grant wasn't there. For the first time, I started my shift alone. The feeds came to life in a wash of muted colors and grainy resolution. Each camera hummed with the subtle static of old security equipment. I scanned the familiar scenes: empty corridors, locked doors, deserted storage rooms. The first hour crawled by without incident, but just after midnight, something strange caught my eye. Camera 6, which showed the eastern loading bay, flickered. For less than a second, the image distorted, and the bay was gone, replaced by a different scene entirely. It looked like a dirt road stretching into the horizon, flanked by dead trees. The sky was gray, and in the distance, a figure walked toward the camera. The flicker snapped, and the loading bay returned. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. My mind whispered explanations: signal interference, a glitch, but deep down, I knew it was neither. At 12:23, the first test came. One of the cleaning staff appeared on camera 9, walking down the north corridor. I remembered Rule 5, never speak to them after midnight, but I'd never been told I couldn't watch. As the figure drew closer to the camera, I noticed something off. Their gait was slow, mechanical, but the arms didn't move. Their head tilted slightly downward, as though staring at something only they could see. Then, as they passed directly under the camera, their head jerked up. Their face was pale, stretched thin like paper, and their eyes, if they were eyes, were black pits. They stared straight into the lens, and though I knew it was impossible, I felt the weight of that stare pressing directly into me. I switched cameras immediately. My hands shook. I'd followed the rule, technically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I'd been watching. At 2:13, camera 19's hallway dimmed once again. The figure emerged, just like before. I focused on it, following the rule exactly. Halfway down the hall, it stopped. For a moment, it seemed to shift, as if its outline was being redrawn in real time. Then it began to raise its hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate. It pointed directly at the camera. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time, it didn't just stand there. It acknowledged me. The rules didn't say what to do if that happened. I held my gaze until 2:16, but the figure didn't turn back this time. Instead, it took one step forward, then another. Each movement made the image flicker like it was slipping between frames. At 2:17, the hallway lights flared back to full brightness and the figure vanished. The tension in my chest didn't ease. At 2:47, camera 12 began to static. I clicked the audio file immediately, letting the deep hum flood the intercom system. But this time, the static didn't clear right away. It swirled in the shape of something vaguely human, pressing forward as if trying to push through the screen. It lingered there, head tilted, before dissolving. The image finally returned to normal. At 3, I braced for camera 7. My eyes locked on another feed, but the system overrode my controls instantly, forcing camera 7 onto the main monitor. The small windowless room was darker than usual. The chair in the center was empty. The emptiness was somehow worse than seeing someone there. A sound broke the silence. A faint tapping, not from my door this time, but from inside the speakers above me. I muted the audio feed, but the tapping continued, like fingernails on glass. Then at 3:06, the chair was no longer empty. Someone sat there, but their head was bent so low their face was hidden. Their hands were resting on their knees, fingers twitching. I looked away, focusing on the clock, until 3:09 passed. When I glanced back, the room was empty again. I thought the worst of the night had passed, but at 3:30, the knocking started. This time, it was soft at first, almost hesitant. Then came a voice, a child's voice. "Please," it whispered, trembling. "They're coming." I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting the instinct to move. My mind screamed at me to open the door, but the rules were clear. The voice continued, growing louder. "Please, I don't want to be here anymore. Please, let me in." Then silence. When I looked at camera 4, the man in the black hat was there again. This time, he was closer to the camera than I'd ever seen. His head was slightly tilted back, and I could see just enough of his mouth to notice that he was speaking, but no sound came through. I switched cameras instantly, my pulse thundering in my ears. For the rest of the shift, nothing happened. The silence was almost worse, like the entire facility was waiting. When Mr. Grant arrived at 6, I almost told him everything. The pointing figure, the static shapes, the child's voice. But before I could speak, he said, "You didn't break the rules. That's all that matters." Then he added, "Not everyone makes it to night 4. I left the facility that morning with the uneasy certainty that something was going to change. The rules had kept me safe so far, but now, whatever was out there knew I was following them. And I had the sickening feeling that soon the rules themselves might break. By the 4th night, I had stopped telling myself this was just a job. It had become something else entirely, a test, maybe, or a trap. I couldn't decide which. The drive-in felt longer than usual, as if the road itself was stretching, trying to keep me away from the building. When the SUV finally stopped at the security gate, the air felt heavier, like the atmosphere thickened the closer I got. When I entered the monitoring room, I immediately noticed something different. The laminated sheet of rules wasn't where I'd left it. It was in the center of my desk, perfectly aligned, like someone had set it there deliberately. Mr. Grant was nowhere to be seen. I sat down, trying to shake off the unease, and scanned the feeds. Everything seemed normal at first. Quiet corridors, empty rooms, guards doing their slow, predictable patrols. But something about the air in the monitoring room felt wrong. The hum of the equipment had changed pitch, almost imperceptibly. At exactly 12:04, camera 8, one of the outside feeds, cut to static for 2 seconds before returning. In its place was a clear night view of the perimeter fence, illuminated by floodlights. And pressed against the fence, hands wrapped around the wire, was a man. His face was pale and distorted, like it had been stretched and pulled into a shape just shy of human. His mouth was open, but no sound came through, his eyes fixed directly on the lens. I switched cameras quickly, but the same image was on camera 2, and camera 5, and camera 10. Every feed I switched to showed the same man, from different impossible angles, all pressing against the fence at once. Then, just as suddenly, they all went back to normal. At 12:31, the first real breach of the rules happened. The feed on camera 7 came on by itself. It wasn't 3 a.m. yet. The room was darker than I'd ever seen it, the corners swallowed in black. The chair was empty again, but something about the shadows made it look occupied. I forced my eyes away, but the feed popped up on the second monitor. Then the third, then the fourth. Every screen in the room showed that empty chair. I shut my eyes tight, gripping the edge of the desk, trying to ride out the wave of cold that swept through me. But when I opened them again, the screens were blank, completely black. In the silence, a faint tapping started on the desk beside me. Not the door, not the speakers, the desk. I turned my head slowly. There was nothing there, just the laminated rule sheet. But one corner of it was lifting, as if being pulled upward by invisible fingers. I snatched it off the desk. The sheet felt colder than the air around it. My hands shook as I set it face up in front of me. The rules had changed. The words were the same font, the same spacing, but Rule 7 had been replaced. It now read, "If you hear knocking, open the door. You will be safe." My stomach twisted. I knew damn well the original Rule 7 said the opposite. I shoved the sheet under a stack of folders and kept watching the monitors, determined to follow the original version. At 2:13, the hallway on camera 19 dimmed as usual. But this time, the figure didn't come from the far end. It simply stepped into the frame from the side, as if it had been standing just out of view all along. It was closer to the camera than I'd ever seen. The details of its face still weren't clear, but I could make out the outline of its mouth, wide and unnatural, stretching too far across its face. Then it spoke. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the movement of its lips. I had the horrible certainty that it was speaking my name. My eyes stayed locked on it until 2:16, but instead of walking away, it moved toward the camera. The feed flickered, closer, closer, until the entire frame was filled with a distorted blur of pale skin and shadow. When the hallway lights came back on, it was gone. I barely had time to catch my breath before 2:47 hit. Camera 12's static returned, but the audio file didn't work this time. I played it twice, and still the image didn't clear. The static began to ripple, forming shapes like stretched faces, eyes blinking open and shut. It looked like dozens of people pressing against a thin veil, their mouths moving silently. Then, as if pushed by some invisible hand, the static washed away, leaving the corridor empty. At 3 a.m., the system once again forced camera 7 onto the main screen. This time, the chair wasn't empty. The person sitting there had their head lifted, staring straight at me. Their face was blank, not expressionless, but literally blank. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. I looked away instantly, but when I glanced at the door to the monitoring room, my blood ran cold. Someone was standing there. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They just stood, facing the door, unmoving. The outline of their head was perfectly round, like the featureless face on the camera. And then, finally, the knocking began. It was slow, rhythmic, heavy. I didn't move. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then a voice, calm and deep. "The rules have changed. Open the door." I didn't answer. After a moment, the voice spoke again, louder this time. "You're making it worse." The handle of the door twitched once, then turned all the way. I waited for it to swing open, but it didn't. It just stayed like that. The knob turned, as if whoever was out there was deciding whether to push it. Then suddenly, every screen in the room switched to camera 4. The man in the black hat was back. Only now he wasn't in the hallway. He was inside the monitoring room. He was standing behind me. The cameras didn't lie. Every feed showed the same angle. Camera 4's hallway was gone, replaced by a perfect, crystal-clear image of the monitoring room, seen from somewhere over my shoulder. And in that image, just behind my chair, stood the man in the black hat. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The hat was wide-brimmed, shadowing his face, but I could see enough in the monitors to know he was smiling. Not the warm kind of smile, the kind that made my chest tighten and my hands go cold. The air felt thicker, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I could hear his breathing, steady, slow, deliberate. "Turn around," he said. I didn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the nearest monitor, even as his voice slid closer to my ear. "You've been very careful," he said, "but you've made mistakes." His tone was conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. "I followed the rules. You followed their rules," he said, "not mine." A sound like the brushing of fabric came from directly behind me. I could see on the monitors that his hand was reaching out, not toward me, but toward the console, his long fingers hovering just above the controls. "Do you know why the rules exist?" he asked. I stayed silent. He chuckled quietly, and the sound scraped something raw in the back of my mind. "They're not to protect you from us. They're to protect us from you." I wanted to ask what he meant, but my throat felt locked. Suddenly, the cameras began changing on their own, cycling rapidly through every feed. Each one showed the same thing: hallways, storage rooms, exterior views. But something small was off in every frame. A door where there shouldn't be one, a figure standing in a shadow that didn't exist before. Faces of the guards blurred into shapeless masses, then snapped back into clarity. The man moved closer. I could feel the brim of his hat brush the top of my head. "I'll show you something," he whispered. Before I could react, every screen went black. Then, slowly, an image faded in, a single hallway I didn't recognize. It wasn't part of the facility I'd seen before. The walls were the same dull white, but they seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the perspective warping the longer I stared. Something moved at the far end. It looked like a person crawling, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, jerking forward in bursts. The man in the black hat tilted his head toward the image. "That's where the rules come from," he said. "From the other side." The crawling thing stopped, as if it had heard him. Slowly, its head twisted toward the camera. It had no eyes, just deep, vertical slits where they should have been. Its mouth opened, and the screen filled with a burst of static so loud it made me flinch. When the static cleared, the hallway was empty again. The man in the black hat straightened up. "Tonight they'll change again," he said, "and you'll have to choose which version to follow." Then, without a sound, he was gone. The monitors returned to their normal feeds, like nothing had happened. The rest of the night dragged on in a haze. Every sound seemed sharper, every flicker of the cameras a possible breach. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't left, that he was still somewhere in the building, watching. At 4:12, camera 10 caught something outside the eastern fence. It was the man in the black hat again, but this time he wasn't looking at the building. He was facing away, head tilted slightly upward, as if listening to something only he could hear. The feed flickered once, and when it came back, he was gone. At 5 a.m., just an hour before the shift ended, I noticed movement on camera 19. The hallway was dim again, but the figure wasn't there. Instead, there was a chair, an exact replica of the one in camera 7's room, sitting in the middle of the corridor. It was empty. For now. I stared at it for a full minute, expecting something to appear. Nothing did. But when I finally switched cameras, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The chair had been turned. It was facing the direction of the monitoring room. By the time Mr. Grant arrived, I felt hollowed out, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. He studied me for a moment, then glanced at the rule sheet. I hadn't noticed until then. The sheet had changed again. This time, Rule 3 was different. It now read, at 3 a.m., you must look at camera 7 and maintain eye contact with whoever is in the chair. The original version said never to look directly at them. Mr. Grant's expression was unreadable. Don't ignore it, he said. Not tomorrow night. And then he left. I drove home in silence, knowing that on night 5, I'd have to break a rule I'd been clinging to like a lifeline. The 6th night was the hardest driving yet. The road felt wrong again. Not longer this time, but unfamiliar. Street signs were blank, like someone had scrubbed the names away. I kept catching glimpses in the rearview mirror of headlights that weren't there when I turned to look. When I finally pulled into the facility lot, the air was still and heavy. No wind, no insect noise, nothing. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you'd walked into a room you weren't supposed to enter. Mr. Grant was already in the monitoring room when I arrived. He didn't look up from the console when I came in. The rule sheet was laid out in front of him, perfectly flat. Read it, he said. I did. 3 rules were different now. 1. If the hallway on camera 19 dims, stand up and face the door until the lights return. 2. At 3 a.m., look at camera 7 and maintain eye contact with whoever is in the chair. 3. If there is knocking, open the door. You will be safe. I looked up at him. They've been changing every night, he nodded slowly. Yes. Who's changing them? I asked. His eyes finally met mine. They are. The rules are a negotiation. Sometimes they win, sometimes we do. I waited for him to explain further, but he just stood, patted my shoulder once, and walked out without another word. The night began quietly, too quietly. Midnight passed without the man at the fence. 12:31 came and went without the figure on camera 19. Even the static on camera 12 never appeared. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt the tension building like pressure in my ears. At 2:13, the hallway on camera 19 dimmed. This time, I did as the new rule said. I stood and faced the door, keeping my eyes away from the monitors. The air in the room shifted, like someone had stepped inside without opening the door. I could feel something moving in the space between me and the wall. Slow, deliberate pacing. The lights came back on, and the feeling vanished. I sat back down, my legs trembling. At 2:47, I braced for static on camera 12. It didn't come. Instead, every monitor switched to a live feed of the outside gate. The man in the black hat was there again, but he wasn't alone. The featureless figure from camera 7 was standing beside him. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood side by side, both facing the building. And then the clock ticked to 3 a.m. The system overrode itself, forcing camera 7 onto the main screen. The chair was occupied. The figure sitting there was almost human, but its proportions were slightly wrong. Its arms were too long, its head just a little too narrow, its posture too still. The skin on its face was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin. I kept my eyes locked on it, just as the new rule said. After a moment, the skin began to ripple. Slowly, features pushed through. First, the shallow depressions of eye sockets, then a faint indentation for a mouth. I realized with a jolt that the features weren't random. It was making my face. Within seconds, I was staring at myself. The double smiled, and it was the same smile I'd seen on the man in the black hat. A knock came at the door, 3 slow, heavy thuds. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed not to, but the new rule said I'd be safe. The knocking came again, louder. My double in the chair tilted its head toward the sound. I understood then. It wasn't telling me to open the door for them. It was telling me to open the door for it. The knock came a 3rd time, and the door handle began to turn. I stood, crossed the room, and opened it. The man in the black hat was there, smiling as always. Behind him stood the featureless figure, my double, now wearing my face fully formed. "You've done well," the man said. "You can rest now." Before I could react, the double stepped past me into the monitoring room and sat down at the console. It began watching the cameras, moving the controls exactly as I would. The man in the black hat stepped aside, gesturing toward the hallway. "It's time to go," he said. I glanced back at the double. It didn't look at me. It was focused on the screens, completely absorbed in the job. I stepped into the hallway, and the door closed behind me with a sound that felt final. The corridors were empty. The facility was silent. I kept walking, but the halls seemed longer than they should be, stretching into turns that led to more empty corridors. At some point, I realized I was no longer inside the building. The floor had become bare concrete, the walls fading into darkness. Ahead of me, a long white hallway stretched into infinity, the same one I'd seen on the monitors when the man had shown me the other side. Somewhere far down that hall, something was crawling toward me. I turned to go back, but the door was gone. I never made it home from that shift. I don't know what's been watching the cameras since then, but I do know one thing. If you ever take a job at a government facility in Iowa and they hand you a sheet of rules, read them. Then read them again the next night. They won't be the same. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Most don't. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your time in the dark is never taken for granted here. If this story lingered with you, leave a like, share it with someone who thinks they can handle it, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you'll be here when the next tale finds its way to your screen. Until then, keep the lights on. You never know who might be watching.